It's episode 4, y'all. Welcome to the Good Word Podcast with Goodwill. I'm Vincent Goodwill, your host from Yahoo Sports. We are here on Mondays on the Ball Don't Lie Network. Get us wherever you get your podcast. And we're also on YouTube, so you can see my lovely face. If you're looking on YouTube, you see the man next to me on the other side, the hate hard king himself, Amin Elhassan. Amin, I'm gonna give you a quick rundown of your illustrious career. You were a member of the Suns front office for I think 6 or 7 years, right?
6 years, yep.
6 years after an internship with the Knicks, which caused you a lot of scars and bruising. And then you went to ESPN.
Taught me a lot.
Taught you a lot. Then you went to ESPN, where you were a talking head for a number of years. Now, in addition to doing satellite radio work with NBA and Sirius, you're a member of the Dan Le Batard and Friends Network. You have the Basketball Illuminati podcast and the Cinephile podcast if you are into movies. I mean, you literally do everything. So before we get into the play-in preview, I mean, do you want to talk coaches being fired, or do you want to talk fights? I have a feeling which one you want to go to. What do you want to do first?
Oh, man. Let's start with fights, man. Like coaches, I would say coaches being restructured. That's the new term. Reassigned. We don't fire coaches. We reassign coaches.
We find ways to make the money worth our while. That's what that is. We find ways to pay you and make sure that you're doing some work. Shout out to you. But fights, of course, y'all. We thought Game 82 was going to be the most boring day of the year. We thought it was going to be blowouts. We thought it was going to be nonsense. And it turned out to be nonsense in a whole different way. And then we found out someone might have gotten their chest blown in. So we just had a lot of stuff going on. Our guy, Rudy Gobert in Minnesota, was called Too Short's favorite word by Karl Anderson. And
why they gotta say it like short?
Why you gotta say it like short? We can't do it on these airways, but y'all know exactly what word I'm saying. And if you had any level of experience with the word, you're going to find out if that person really is what you say he is, okay?
Yeah.
And Rudy Gobert punched Karl Anderson in the chest. He was subsequently sent home after even a halftime discussion between the two with their game against the New Orleans Pelicans, a game that actually meant something. They wound up coming back after being down 12. But before we even get to the game itself, I mean, I'm just going to give you the floor. Because when I saw it, I was like, Rudy Gobert has had enough of the disrespect. Y'all not going to keep coming at me talking about me being French and y'all going to play me off the floor. Rudy had enough. And Karl Anderson just happened to be the dude that day that said the right word at the right time.
Yeah, my reaction was, well, first of all, like, just not what you want to see. I know people are like, oh, I like fight. Like, you don't want to see that on the sideline.
No.
But more importantly, Kyle didn't seem very fazed by that punch. It was kind of like, did you just actually touch me? And attacked, and then, Rudy kind of backtracked. So it didn't have the desired effect, I would say, of, wow, he finally stood up for himself. It was kind of like Damon Wayans in The Great White Hype when he's in that final fight and he's kind of messing around, and Irish Terry Conklin hits him, and he's like, are you trying to hit me for real? Like, there's that like moment of like, have you lost your mind? So it wasn't the intimidation factor that one would hope for if you're Rudy Gobert. And then obviously everything that came after it, the transcripts and the audio, it showed it definitely didn't have the desired effect. And to me, that's the more interesting part, is the stuff that Karl Anderson said in that audio clip in the locker room or on the way to the locker room, where he's like, he's been like this all year long and you guys don't do anything about it. And that's one of those things where in the NBA that happens a lot, where there's someone who behaves in a way, it's not like a toxic way or kind of a detrimental way, but a little bit of a baby. And rather than nip it in the bud, a lot of times teams will just ignore him. Just let him, he's just blowing off steam or whatever. And sometimes they're right, because it is just someone who's just talking and don't pay it no mind. And sometimes it allows that person to create a delusion in their head of who they are, or where they stand, of where they stand in the locker room hierarchy. and all that. And when tensions flare, what Rudy discovered is that Kyle Anderson isn't gonna continue with the charade.
Yep.
That you're a leader,
Yep.
or that you're like some sort of voice that is respected in this locker room or anything. You are what we think you are, which is Too Short's favorite word.
Well, the thing, like you said, it was two things came up for me. One, especially when you talk about hierarchy in the locker room, I mean, they traded, what, 5 first-round picks or 4 first-round picks for Rudy Gobert?
Yeah. Yep.
And he's on a massive extension, a $200 million extension, a generational, make no mistake about it, he's a generational defensive player. Right? When you talk about defensive players in this league's history, it ain't just the Defensive Player of the Year awards. He's literally, the numbers say, he is one of those guys that will go down in history. And he walks in that locker room from Utah believing that he has earned a level of respect and admiration from these dudes because they've never accomplished anything. And they're looking at him like, what have you accomplished? Or better yet, who are you to try to walk in carrying a big stick? And this is a locker room with Karl Anthony-Towns in it. You know what I mean? Like, there's nobody there. I mean, there's no one there that is going to strike fear into anybody. And Anthony Edwards is coming into his own and everything else. And so, I mean, even as we spin this forward, you know, because they have this play-in game, and don't forget Jaden McDaniels also, you know, punched the wall and broke his hand.
Oh, yeah, man, I forgot about that.
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
Like, hey, does this reflect on the head coach, Chris Finch? Like each individual thing is its own thing, but does the macro rather reflect on the organization, the head coach, what they've built, or is this something that we're going to all forget about if they beat the Lakers in a couple days?
We're not going to forget about it because ultimately it is an issue, right? This wasn't LeBron and Mario Chalmers on the sideline, right? Where it's just like tense game, frustrated, yelling at each other, right?
Right.
If it was just, hey, why don't you grab a rebound? Hey, why don't you block a shot or whatever? Then I think you just kind of like, just tensions in a game that meant something to this team.
Right.
But the Kyle Anderson audio indicates this is something that's been festering all year long.
Yep.
That's been unresolved, unaddressed. And I think in that sense, that's the part where I think Chris Finch, his staff, and the Timberwolves organization, they do bear some responsibility, because when you close your eyes and hope a problem goes away, or continuously saying it's not a problem when in fact it is a problem, this is what happens. These things grow and fester, and then you reach a point where you've got this sort of situation happening. And that's something that needs to be managed head on. It needs to be discussed head on. You know, Golden State, and it's kind of funny because Draymond Green, as soon as the story came out, tweeted the same thing that Rudy Gobert tweeted about him.
The pettiest human beings alive, man.
Yep. But Golden State kind of went through this a little bit, in that Jordan Poole is a guy who chirps, and they similarly were like, just ignore him. That's just who he is, da-da-da. But the tensions of whatever was happening in Draymond Green's life and his career and his contract and all that stuff led to a point where it's like, no, I'm not going to pretend anymore that I'm okay with this and that he can say whatever he wants.
Right.
I'm going to, take matters into my own hands. And he did.
Literally my own hands.
Yeah. He put hands on him. He did. Now, the difference is those guys have won a championship.
Mm-hmm. There's some sweat equity there.
So that can erase a lot of stuff, right? First of all, Jordan won a championship last year. He was a major contributor to the championship. And they know, hey, we don't have to like each other. And I think the 96, the Bulls of the 90s, particularly the 96, 97, 98 Bulls, taught us, like, we don't have to be friends. We're just coworkers. And as long as we're functional in the workspace, then I don't care if we hang out afterwards. So I think there is an element of that to the Warriors where it's like, no matter how I feel about this guy, I know that we are all necessary components to success.
Right. Well, here's the other part. And it was in that the success that they really haven't had this year. Like, they've had greater internal expectations than the league had of them. You know what I mean? When we looked at the Western Conference and those teams from that 5 to 10 spot, when you and including Phoenix, as being a team that could have championship expectations, we didn't think of Minnesota at all. We weren't saying, hey, Minnesota gets in, you know what I mean? They're going to be dangerous, even though they have some of the components for that. We didn't think of them that way. But you have Ant Edwards, who is a budding star. You got Karl Towns on a supermax. You got Rudy Gobert on a supermax. Like, I mean, they're going to have to make some decisions regardless of how all this shakes out. Even if they beat the Lakers, getting to 7 and wind up taking, Memphis and giving Memphis a nice run. You know what I mean? They still have decisions to make.
No, absolutely. I mean, they have decisions to make because, again, and the point I was building to was the idea that, A, y'all haven't done anything as a collective. B, the individuals haven't done much either to warrant, whatever sort of ego to it. But C, and this is the most important thing, is this is a newly put together team. So very quickly, you talk about having to make decisions. You got to make decisions about changes that you just made a year ago. Kyle Anderson was signed last offseason. Rudy Gobert was acquired last offseason. And, you can point to injuries and say, well, we don't know yet and the jury's still out. But when Towns and Rudy Gobert were on the floor together, I don't think any of us were blown away about how dominant that lineup was.
Right.
And, from that perspective, you have to say, wow, we got to make changes, but also we're out, as you said, 4 first-round picks. So we have to maneuver around that by either acquiring in return or trying to figure out what the pockets of trade eligibility to our picks is, which is why the whole trade the sun, moon, and the stars thing is a dangerous game. It's not because, you gave away all your picks. It's like because it hamstrings your ability to make other deals with those picks. Not like, I was going to draft the 27 Yankees with these picks.
Right.
It's the idea that, like, once I've betrothed them to someone else, now the next time a good deal comes along, I'm operating with my hands handcuffed behind my back.
Yep. Or the bottom line is when you do something like that, there has to be a collective agreement among players, front offices, and coaches in that room and say, this better work.
Yep.
And it didn't work. And it hasn't worked, and it doesn't look like it will work. And I'm not sure where, honestly, a person who had nothing to do with the fight, I don't know where Karl Towns fits in this. Who is on a Supermax contract, but I don't know if he's a franchise leader type. And if you bring in Rudy Gobert, you're not going to trade him after 1 year. At least I don't think, right?
Well, you're not going to get the reason why. It's not because after 1 year. It's because you're not going to get the return, right? You paid X. You're going to get like 0.5X on the return because it didn't work. Whereas Towns, this is the interesting thing. Towns wasn't involved in the fight at all. And ultimately, he might be the one that has to go because he's the one that holds the most value outside of Anthony Edwards, who I don't think anyone expects him to move.
Right.
And he's the one, not only that, but he's coming up on another deal soon.
Yep.
Like, how long do you want to stay vested in the Karl Anthony-Towns business, particularly when you consider kind of what he's been and what he hasn't been for them?
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the business decisions that teams have to make that they don't want to make because they've made mistakes in the past, I present to you the Dallas Mavericks, right?
Oh, boy.
I mean,
yeah.
So it's a very easy thing to blame Kyrie Irving, right?
Yep.
It is the topic du jour. Kyrie Irving is an easy target. I've taken shots at him. I'm sure, we've all made the jokes. We've all everything.
Never.
Right? We've all done it, and in my opinion, it's all been fair. But in this case, there are so many culprits to the Dallas Mavericks situation. Yeah. There are 2 main culprits, and it's not Nico Harrison, and it's not Jason Kidd. It's Luka Doncic, and it's Mark Cuban. And if we're going to flip it, it's Mark Cuban 75% and Luka Doncic 25%. Yeah. And, I mean, Mark Cuban has owned this team for 20-plus years. and he's had Dirk, and he's had Luka, and he has not been able to attract free agents. He turns people off with the things that he says, and then he does this cockamamie thing at the end where he says, "You know what? We're going to just sit everybody in this game against Chicago and pull ourselves out of the play-in business." After we made this all-in move to get Kyrie Irving to get ourselves in a higher position in the Western Conference, the easy thing is to say, "Kyrie, this is your fault." But the best thing to say is that Mark Cuban has to take a strong look in the mirror before he moves forward with anything.
Right. I mean, this I probably will give it even more on Mark Cuban's plate than Luka. Luka has some responsibility, both in terms of how he approaches the game from his conditioning standpoint, how he approaches the game in terms of point of emphasis, his willingness or lack thereof to give up the ball, his desire or lack thereof to play defense. Like there are things that I think most teams will have issues like that with players. Hey, I wish he was a little bit more collaborative. I wish he was a little bit, better shape or whatever. All across the league, there are examples of this. But the reality is the Mavericks and Mark Cuban in particular have a nasty habit of thinking they're smarter than everybody else and then finding out they're not, right? So, and there are multiple examples of this. You could go with Steve Nash. Steve Nash is a free agent. Phoenix offers $65 million over 5 years, which was, even by those standards of the day, still a very modest contract. Mark Cuban famously said he'll never see the end of that contract. And dude won 2 MVPs and was all NBA first team like 3 times, whatever, in those first 5 years. Like, he was absolutely wrong about that. Then they win the championship, and they had a lot of free agent decisions, including Tyson Chandler and JJ Barea, 2 massive contributors to their success. And Mark Cuban's thing was, let them all walk. We're going to save this cap space and then go get Dwight Howard in the next offseason or some other big name player. And they did that. They won a championship. They basically tore it down, Miami Marlins style. And the next offseason came, and they swung and they missed, and they ended up having to give the bag to somebody, and they gave it to Chandler Parsons.
Oh, that's right.
Just wasn't that guy, right? And then fast forward, it's DeAndre Jordan, and we're going to get him, and then you missed out on that. And then you have Jalen Brunson. I'm sure I'm missing other examples of this, but
plenty of Brunson.
Jalen Brunson miscalculation, and
the Porzingis trade.
The Porzingis trade, where they gave up a lot of stuff for a guy who medically wasn't clear whether he was going to be able to have a career. And then even little things, when you think about it, they lost Brunson, and their answer was to go out and get Christian Wood and give JaVale McGee a hefty,
full mid-level exception.
Yeah, full mid-level, when all he had been making for the last umpteen years playing on championship teams was minimum.
Yep.
Like, he made minimum in Golden State. He made minimum as a Laker. He made minimum in Phoenix. And now you're going to take this guy who, while impactful and effective, the market has spoken. He's a minimum player. And you're going to pay him 10 times or 7 times, whatever that is. All of those things are examples, but are also like building blocks that got us to the edifice that stands before us right now, which is the Dallas Mavericks dumpster fire.
No, there's a line from one of my favorite trash fire shows, Power, when Joe Proctor was getting Tommy out of jail on a technicality. And he used the line, fruit from a poisonous tree. That the tree is Mark Cuban.
I was about to say
the tree is Cuban.
It's Mark Cuban. Yeah.
Cuban is the tree. So now you compound everything by going to get Kyrie Irving. And what's that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot 2 of the biggest things, where you have a massive sexual harassment case on your business side.
Yep.
And then you have a case where your former GM is suing you and you're countersuing him back. And that kind of got swept under the rug, Vinny. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just want to point out that Donnie Nelson sued the team, claiming certain things.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just saw the lawsuit, you say, wow, that sounds kind of outlandish. Sounds like a bitter employee. And then you see the Mavericks response is like, what, you're confirming some of the things he's talking about. Like, no, we didn't offer him that much. We offered him this much. I'm like, no, what are you doing? And it just speaks to a culture of incompetence, of just dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what Mark Cuban has, and it's funny you said he's been an owner for 20 years, and I'm like, wow, it's been that long. It's been long enough for Mark Cuban to go from brash firebrand to old guard. But what he has definitively as an asset that most other owners don't have is he has great PR.
Mm-hmm.
This dude manages to make things fall off him that other owners, even championship owners, guys like Dan Gilbert and Joe Lacob, they don't have that Teflon that Mark Cuban has. And kudos to him, I guess, but like, make no mistake, this is all his fault.
Put it like this. Once again, each individual decision may have a rationale. It may have made sense. The Mavericks in 2011 may have said, you know what? We see the Oklahoma City Thunder coming. We see Kevin Durant and James Harden and Russell Westbrook, and we can't hold them off with these guys.
Mm-hmm.
In theory, you get it because the Thunder went to the finals the next year, and we got to see where that train was going to go. But you give yourself a chance, and they didn't give themselves a chance. And even with this recent team that made the Western Conference Finals, and you can say maybe they made it in smoke and mirrors because they were in the right place at the right time to beat Phoenix when Phoenix went down in flames, right? Okay, but you had a team that could squeeze and take advantage of that. Now you bring in Kyrie Irving. Once again, I'm going to say this. No fault of his own.
Yep.
But he's not the answer.
But
right? He's not the problem, but he's not the answer.
You know what he was? He was the Mavericks were a dam that was spouting leaks. And in order to fill a certain leak, they took a whole bunch of stuff from the other leaks and put it there. It's like, we're done here, right? It's like, oh, we can't defend and our, we got some problems here and our stars out of shape, whatever. Like, let's take some of our defensive leak stops and stop gaps and put it right here in terms of not being able to generate offense outside of Luka. And like, cool, we're good, right? Except now it's gushing this way, and they never really addressed that.
And to me, now they're feeling like they have to perhaps give Kyrie the full max. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. I don't know if that is necessarily a smart move. And to Kyrie's credit, we haven't heard much from him on the, outside of just being on the floor since he's gotten there. It's been 2 months of good behavior, right? And I'm going to bring in my producer, John Gennaro, because John watches every Dallas Mavericks game. And John made up an interesting point in the pre-show meeting. And John, tell us what you told me about how good Dallas looked this year or when they were at their best.
Yeah, I mean, I was just telling you that the best the Mavericks looked, probably offensively, but maybe also a little bit defensively this season, was when Kyrie was on the floor with the team and Luka wasn't. Especially that first week after they got Kyrie when Luka was still hurt. I think he had an ankle thing. And with Kyrie on the floor, he moved the ball around. He got everyone involved. You saw people hustling more on the defensive end as a result of it. And you could see why the Mavericks were like, oh, if you add this to what Luka does offensively, it's going to be great. But then they brought back Luka and it turned back into the Luka offense where it didn't move as much and there's guys not touching the ball and therefore there's guys doing a lot less on defense. So I'm not a big Kyrie fan for a lot of the off the court stuff, but I totally understood the idea of the on the court stuff, watching him with a bunch of bums win some games against good teams.
Let me ask you guys a question, because I've seen this in a lot of places and people doing what I affectionately call the Doc Rivers. Or it's not Blake's fault. This is not Kyrie's fault, right? I haven't seen anyone blame Kyrie for this. I just see a line of people like, it's not Kyrie's fault. Like, I don't think anyone, neither Mavs fans, neither local media, national media, I haven't heard even like the talking head pundits that are generalists that don't follow the game on a day-to-day basis, that will make it easy to point to. Not even they're leaping at that.
That's true. I haven't seen much of that. But I think where you get down to it is, Kyrie's reputation follows him.
Yeah.
We all realize that. Kyrie's rep completely follows him, especially with everything that happened in Brooklyn. And then B, there's some free agent decisions, that they got to make, that he has to make and that they have to make. And we know he wants the full max, the full 5-year, 240, 250, or whatever it is. That's a huge decision that Mark Cuban will have to make. And will he make it because he wants to have something to show for Kristaps Porzingis, Jalen Brunson, all the guys that they lost? Do you make this decision, knowing, A, I'm not sure how this Kyrie thing is going to work, and B, we're still going to have all the same holes and flaws that we had this season anyway?
So there's a lot of things that are happening here. There's a lot of moving parts, and part of it is driven off of Kyrie's reputation, and part of it is driven off of what the Mavericks have to do with their team. But long and short of it is this. Kyrie Irving is an unrestricted free agent. Kyrie Irving left Brooklyn because he felt like they were not committed enough to him contractually for the future and as an organization. If you look around the league, Vinny, and you say, what are the teams that are vying for Kyrie Irving's services? The list is surprisingly short. The teams that have the financial wherewithal in terms of cap space are not willing, right?
Right.
But not because he's a bad guy or whatever, but because what does Detroit need with Kyrie Irving?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And vice versa. What does Kyrie need with Detroit? What does anyone need for Detroit, for that matter?
Hey, you better watch yourself.
An airport. That's what we need Detroit for. A beautiful airport.
You're gonna come here over the summer. You're gonna come here the next time they're in the playoffs, and you're gonna have a ball.
I've got a friend of mine who lives in Miami who's from Detroit who keeps saying, come to Detroit this summer. So this summer, I'm going to make my long-awaited Detroit return. I've been to Detroit. A lot of people are like, oh, you ain't never been to Detroit. I've been there.
But you ain't. Here's the thing. You've been to Detroit, but you ain't kicked it in Detroit.
I ain't kicked it in Detroit, and I definitely haven't gone when the weather was nice. I've been when the weather was terrible, lots of times, and that might color my opinion. But I digress, right? So the teams that are willing, first of all, there aren't that many of them. It's a limited number,
right?
And second of all, most of them don't have the wherewithal. So the Lakers is a destination that's mentioned very frequently. Well, the problem is the Lakers don't have much outside of trading all the assets that they work so hard to replenish. I mean, they went from a system of having 3 big stars and everybody else is on the minimum. It didn't work.
Right.
It was like bad news for them. So they shrewdly, I thought, the second best trade deadline of any team after Suns acquiring Kevin Durant was the Lakers, because they managed to turn Russell Westbrook into a bevy of rotation players and not have to give up the farm to do it.
Right.
To get Kyrie Irving, it would have to be in a sign and trade.
Yep.
They'd have to do it all over again. They'd have to give up all the depth that they just got, and they've been playing great. They had the 3rd or 4th best record in the NBA since
they had the best record in the West since the All-Star break.
Right, and the best defense in the league since the All-Star break, or right up there. You're gonna take all that. Oh, finally, we dug out of that hole. Ooh, let's dig another hole. As a result, so it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I say all this to say, if you're Dallas, you kind of got the market cornered here. You don't have to give him 4 or 5 years of max money. So now it becomes, okay, well, how much can we give him? Like, where can we play here? How low can we go with years? I would say, given his injury history and then his history of just not being available for whatever reason, I don't see how you give him more than a 2-year deal.
Yeah. I was thinking 2. I was thinking maybe 2 with an option.
I don't think he would agree to a team option. I think he would, if it's going to be 2 years, I think he'd rather have 2 years than 2 years and not have the ability to go out there and get something else.
That's true. No.
But then, like, what's that number? What's that dollar amount? Right? Because that's the other part of this. Like, well, like, you can play around with that. Like, are we giving him the maximum allowable for someone of his years of experience? can you afford to mess around with that? Like those are all kind of questions I think that are bubbling out there.
Well, I will close with this, and this will be what we call in show business a tease. I have an idea for the Dallas Mavericks. After the draft lottery, whenever the draft order is revealed, and assuming they are not in the top 4 of draft picks, the Dallas Mavericks have a chance to do something that's not really pretty, but maybe really necessary. You call up whoever has that first pick, and you say, can we get Big Vic for Luka Doncic?
Oh, wow. No, wow.
That's
okay.
That's what you. It's crazy, but it might be necessary. And the crazy thing is, I'm not sure if there are a lot of teams that if San Antonio gets the number 1 pick, you think they're trading for Luka Doncic, and we're talking about a top 5 player. Detroit isn't trading the top pick for Luka Doncic.
No, it really depends, Vinny. Because on the one hand, Luka's a proven commodity, right?
Yep.
And that's like, no matter how much we all feel very optimistic about Victor Wembanyama, but at the end of the day, he plays in the French league, so the competition ain't stout. He's played under, he basically hasn't played on senior national team stuff, so the competition isn't stout. And based on his size and his frame, there is historical reason to believe injuries are going to be an issue for him. Everyone who is past a certain height,
right, foot problems.
It was, everyone was playing. Porzingis, George Muresan, Sean Bradley, Yao Ming, has nothing to do with how good they are as players. I just named a very wide variety of players there, but they all had lower extremity problems. Zydrunas Ilgauskas is another one. Once you pass 7'2", it gets real iffy, right? That's one. The other thing is, look, for Dallas, and you've been to Dallas, it is, for those who don't know, Dallas, first of all, think of the television show Dallas. Let's just start there, from the 80s. Second of all, it's where Neiman Marcus is headquartered. There is, in that town, not in every NBA town, but in a town like Dallas, a certain premium for having a white superstar. Victor Wembanyama might be just as good as we all think he is, and it still may not be worth it monetarily for the Mavericks to give up Luka Doncic, because he represents to them something that wouldn't have the same hold or sway in New York or in LA or in Chicago or in Miami.
Yeah.
There are a lot of cities, and of course, they'd love to have him, but the fact that he's white doesn't carry the booster that it does in a city like Dallas. Dallas, that's huge for them.
Well, I'll close with this. People thought that Dallas was on the upswing as recently as last year. It can turn very, very quickly with very little warning, because Dallas is now one of those teams that is legit at a crossroads. And you have all these combustible figures, and even though it's nobody's fault, somebody gonna have to pay the price. I mean, we don't have a Black Monday in the NBA, right? Like in NFL, it's like Black Monday. When the season is over, coaches get fired. We had a Black Sunday. We had a Black Easter Sunday. And I don't mean you getting up and going to church with your 5-button suits in your hat. I mean a different type of Black Easter Sunday. I mean the type of Easter Sunday, where you literally walk off the floor and you see a tweet from Woj. In the case of Steven Silas, done in Houston. In the case of Dwayne Casey in Detroit, he's going to the front office. Now, a couple days ago, Dwayne Casey said, I had a lot of basketball left in me. He said that. He said that in front of the media after the last Pistons home game. And now, after the game in Chicago, he said, you know what, it's just time. I'm going to move him to the front office. He's got a year and $7 million left on his contract.
Mm-hmm.
And the Pistons clearly wanted to make, I believe, a long-term decision. They didn't want to kick the can down the road. But I won't say either one of these guys got screwed because they're, clearly being paid a lot of money and everything else. But Dwayne Casey came off being coach of the year in Toronto. And he could have sat out a year. And instead, the Pistons came at him with Blake Griffin and Reggie Jackson and Andre Drummond, which is a decent enough group of players, not anybody's finals team, and said, hey, we want you to coach a contender. And then midstream, amidst the pandemic and everything else, they say, nope, we're going to strip this all down to the ground, and you're going to have to wear all of these losses.
Mm-hmm.
I won't even say does it seem fair, because fair, who cares about fair? But are either of those jobs attractive to you on the back end of this now?
Well, I'm gonna say, first of all, I'm gonna prep producer John, get the bleep button handy. But it is the ballad of the black coach in the NBA. You're handed chicken, asked to make chicken salad out of it, and then they taste it like, oh, this tastes like. I mean, it is mind-boggling to me. And let me start with Coach Silas, because that's the one where it's like, this is not what this was supposed to be. He was hired, as you said, to coach a contender, to coach Russell Westbrook and James Harden, and use his wits to kind of make this grouping work.
Mm-hmm.
And almost instantaneous, I mean, certainly before they had a chance to have a practice. So I guess you can say instantaneously, those stars are out the door.
Yep.
And the team rededicates itself to being young. So young to the point where John Wall's on the team and they tell him, never mind, don't play.
Not even don't play. Don't show up.
Yeah. And I don't want to let John or his representation off the hook, because they were all gung-ho about that too.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, as a part of our SiriusXM season preview show that we did in Houston, sitting there asking Rob Stone and asking Steven Silas, we just saw Chris Paul do it in Oklahoma City. He got traded there. It's a bunch of kids on the team, but he played them up. People were surprised, and that built his trade value. And then he got sent to where, he could eventually, why aren't you guys doing the same thing here? And they were just kind of like, part of it was, John and his camp were pretty adamant that this was the right way to go. And part of it was like, they were like, we're not trying to do that. We're not trying to have somebody play our guys up.
Right.
We're trying to play our young guys. So you play your young guys, and they have the youngest roster, if I'm not mistaken, in the NBA.
Yeah.
By leaps and bounds. What did they expect? Like, you can fire me for not reaching expectations. What were the expectations in Houston is my question.
Mm-hmm.
In Detroit, a very similar story. Guy gets there and a certain type of roster, and very quickly that roster gets flipped into youth and like growth and assets and those sort of kind of balance sheet terms, as opposed to a basketball team. And that's fine, by the way. That is a good strategy to take for both those situations. When it blew up, that's it. We might as well circle the wagons and try to get the most out of what we can get. But the part I don't get is where these head coaches are accountable. I'd love to sit down with Rob Stone, whoever the hell's in charge in Detroit. Is it Troy Weaver? Is it Ed Stefanski? Is it Arn Tellem?
It's a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
That's something that, because it's Detroit, people don't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
But there isn't a very clear, like, I'll name a team right now to you, Vinny, and you're going to tell me instantly who the chief basketball decision maker is. Not the GM, not the exec. Just tell me who the main basketball decision maker is.
Who's making the final calls?
New York.
Leon Rose.
New Orleans.
David Griffin.
The Clippers.
I was about to say something mean. Lawrence Frank.
Yeah, easy there, Diesel. Right? Houston, a team that we're talking about in this conversation. Detroit. I don't know. You people say Troy Weaver, and then I think, is it Troy or is it? Well, Troy's the one who's going to have his name on it.
Troy's going to have to wear the decisions.
Right. So, there's a lot of this kind of just. It's not clear who's in charge, but what is clear is, I look at that roster and I can't expect Detroit to be, especially, by the way, the biggest part of this, who didn't play for Detroit this year?
Number 1 pick, Cade Cunningham. Didn't have him, and when he played, he was battling an injury that clearly limited him. You could see the future star and everything else, but like you said, I mean, how can you have expectations when you have literally 4 centers on a roster? Yeah. For one, right? You have 4 centers on the roster. You trade for James Wiseman. You got Bagley. You got Stewart. And you got Jalen Duren. And then you lose your star ball handler. And then you throw in Jaden Ivey into the fire. It's a lot going on there. But
we knew wasn't ready. We knew he wasn't ready.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were going to ease him in. That's what the thought was. Play those 2 guys together so nobody has the singular burden and that Jaden Ivey can just attack. And granted, Jaden has played much better on the back half of his rookie year than he did to start, similar to Jalen Duren. And that should be a credit to Dwayne Casey. But if you're looking at the future, as the Pistons are, they were looking at it and saying, okay, we're going to make a 5-year decision right now. So now you have coaches like Kevin Ollie, Jerry Stackhouse, maybe a Jay Wright, maybe an Adrian Griffin, maybe an Ime Udoka. The question is, I mean, where do you go? If you're them, do you have a number 1 guy, so to speak? And 2, to your bigger point, we talk all this stuff about black coaches getting opportunities, and the league was patting itself on the back, and they should have. You know, there was 16 black coaches in the league, the highest amount that they've ever had. Not all of them were good jobs or great jobs. Some of them were dead-end jobs that they, like you said, Stephen Silas just had to take. Dwayne Casey, it was a good job when he first got there. Then it turned into a not-so-good job, and now it's going to be a really good job, especially if they give Victor Wembanyama. But how do you balance those 2 things out?
I mean, it's something that I talk about all the time. Whenever people say, well, the NBA doesn't have the problems that the NFL does. And it's true, we don't, but we have different problems. And like, this is not my opinion. You can look at the numbers. You can look at the data. Black coaches tend to start in worse situations with worse teams. They inherit worse teams, and they get a shorter leash on life, basically. And their recalcitrancy, maybe I shouldn't use big words, but the rate in which they get rehired, basically you stay in the carousel, is a lot lower. Stephen Silas waited 24 goddamn years to be a head coach in this league. Grew up on this league. His father played in the league. Father was one of the great coaches in this league. He was like basically created in a lab to be a head coach in this game, both in terms of X's and O's and being a tactician, and also interpersonal relationships.
Right.
Pull a bunch of players, ask them who their favorite coach was. Like guys like Steven Jackson and Gerald Wallace, and all across where he's been in this league. People, time and time again, people say Stephen Silas is one of my favorite coaches to play for. You gave him children. You gave him people who literally were 18 when they joined the team. And you expected him to turn that into what? What was Houston supposed to be? So, and this is the case over and over again. I remember when Alvin Gentry was like going to New Orleans. They played terrible in the bubble. That's what I said at the time. I said, look, they played terrible in the bubble. I don't think they won a game or whatever. It was bad. But also, that was after 3 months off. And earlier in that season, they were the 13th or 14th team in the West, and were terrible, and everyone was hurt. And then Zion comes back, and they make this mad rush. And in March, right before the shutdown, they pulled within 2 games of the 8th seed after being completely out of it. He got them playing. He got them playing well. He got them playing hard. Zion was being everything we thought Zion was going to be. Boom, take 3 months off, come back. Zion's fat as hell. And, some teams hit the ground running in Orlando and some teams didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not casting aspersions, but maybe some of those rules about gatherings weren't quite as heated. But I'm not here to make excuses. They didn't play well in the bubble. We're going to take 8 games and say to Alvin Gentry, hey, them 50 games that we played earlier where you got this team competitive and playing together and playing well, that doesn't matter. These 8 games is what matters. And we're going to get rid of them. And we're going to go hire Stan Van Gundy, who hadn't been in the game. And I love Stan. I know and love and have worked with both Stan and Alvin.
Yep.
They're both my friends.
Yep.
They're both great coaches, great basketball minds. But the circumstances under which Alvin Gentry was fired was bogus. And that's what happens. I remember I tweeted about it, and I think I might have gotten like a text from Griff, like, really? Because Griff's my guy too.
Right.
And these are all like friends of mine. They're not just people I know from the business. These are people that I know, work with, and love. But the ballad of the black coach. Oh, this is when the Pacers fired Nate McMillan after the Heat swept Indiana. Again, 14 days earlier, the team announced it was going to give him a contract extension, right? And this is around the same time as Alvin, right?
Yep.
But Nate McMillan, same thing. You gave me a bad team. We went up against the team that ended up winning the conference, going to the finals.
Right.
And we got beat by a way better team. And so I said, the ballad of the black coach, a metaphor. Tie one hand behind their back. Apply blindfold. Spin them around in a circle. Push them in a UFC octagon. Watch them get their ass kicked. Surmise they're not good enough.
I tell you what. This is the crazy thing. Like, you think of Doc Rivers, you think of Ty Lue. Those might be the only coaches who've like inherited good teams and taken them to a
And what do they have to
championship.
do? Well, I must say, okay. I thought you meant like Ty Lue with the Clippers, right? Because when I say, what does Doc Rivers and Ty Lue have in common? They won a championship.
Right.
And so now, like, okay, now you get to get in the club of where we just keep re-racking you and you're in it. But yeah, Ty Lue inherited one mid-season. Doc Rivers didn't. Doc Rivers had a team, had a terrible team, and he merely avoided like the unfair fate of being blamed for having a bad team. That's all he did. He didn't get gifted anything.
Right.
He merely avoided that, hey, we got a bad team, we don't win games. Let's make this team better. Okay, I get a chance to coach the good team now.
Right. Well, here's the other part. And I'll close it with this because I want to get Amin's thoughts on some of the teams in the play-in. The black coach, it's almost some ageism things too, because it's a weird thing because when you're young, you're too young.
Mm-hmm.
And once you get past 60, all of a sudden you're old. Like the term experienced doesn't always apply. And when you're young, you're not going to get the Mark Dagnall treatment where you're 35.
Will Hardy. Remember Will Hardy?
Prodigy.
Will Hardy was one of the great young coaches in the game. A certain newsbreaker was gooing all over himself a week into the season to tell us about Will Hardy. Where did Will Hardy end up? Just a quick perfunctory look at the standings. 12. 8 games under 500. And again, I'm not knocking Will Hardy. But it is interesting that Will Hardy gets a rush of
you get the push.
Instantly.
You get the push.
Instantly.
Yeah, you get the push.
Stamped. It's instantly stamped in a way that, Jamal Mosley, who had a tough start to the season, but like if you start from after they had that tough start through, they were a very competitive basketball team. And they finished like 3 games apart from the mighty Utah Jazz. But we don't hear Jamal Mosley, prodigy, one of the great young minds, even though Jamal is another lifer, as we like to say, someone who's been in this for a long time. The last thing I'll say on this, because Jamal reminded me of this. Dwayne Casey and Steven Silas represent a specific sect of black employee in the NBA. This is something I've talked about a lot.
I know where you're going with this.
In the NBA, if you're white, you can have any background. You can be a former player. You can be a former college star. You can be straight out of Ivy League or Emerson College or whatever. We don't care about your background. Are you smart? Do you work hard? The job is, or are you related to someone? That's always there, right? The job is yours. But if you're black, I better have a card of you playing somewhere. There better have been a poster. They better sold your jersey somewhere. Because if not, we're going to be on your ass. And Steven Silas and Dwayne Casey both have that in common. They were guys who were lifers, worked in this game. For Dwayne Casey, obviously, he was,
Seattle,
those George Karl staffs. He was
Dallas.
there
All three of those guys went to Dallas. Steven
Yep.
Silas was in Dallas. Jamal Mosley was in Dallas. Dwayne Casey was in Dallas.
Yep.
None
and
of them,
Steven
ironically,
Silas,
are ever coaches of the Dallas Mavericks.
Yeah, exactly. But they got Jason Kidd. That's fine. But the point is, in the NBA, that there is a prejudice, I feel. And maybe I'm biased because I was one of those people where I'm black and no, I didn't play. Because that's what they ask. Where'd you play? They never asked that to the white guys. They asked the black guys, where'd you play? Or if you went to college, where'd you go to college? I went to Arizona State. Oh, were you on the team? I've never seen them ask anybody else that. But I get that question. So it is, I do get defensive about guys like Steven Silas, Dwayne Casey, people who did it the right way and worked their ass off. And there's a million other offshoots of conversations about who is getting interviews and why isn't so-and-so? And I'm like, because these people like these guys have been waiting for decades.
Lifer, like you said, doing it the right way, and then the goalpost moves. I said that about black executives like years ago, and the NBA was like, yeah, I know it's kind of jacked up. Like, you tell black executives, hey, go through scouting, go through personnel, do everything possible, and then you'll get your chance. And then once they got to the front of that line, the NBA completely went in another direction. And it's like, well, you didn't come from an analytics background, or you're not a young whiz kid. Yes. So those problems do exist. As great as the NBA has done in a lot of different places, once I'll give them this, Amin. Once you point out to them that it's a problem, they will say, okay, we're going to try to fix it. But I don't know if you can try to fix certain things. But they do try. I'll just give them that. I'll just leave the NBA there because I don't want to have the minions, the KGB calling me, because they will call. So, Amin, before we let you go, because you've been great today, the play-in, does anything in the play-in excite you? Any of the potential matchups of the play-in excite you? You got Atlanta and Miami, Chicago and Toronto, and in the West, you've got Lakers, Minnesota. We touched on the Lakers earlier, and then New Orleans and Minnesota in the 9-10.
Yeah, I think the 7-8s, yes. The 9-10s, not so much, right? Like, let's be honest. I think Toronto has the best chance of actually moving up from the 9-10 games out of the 4 teams there. And by moving up, I mean like making it to the egg spot to the playoffs. Yeah. But ultimately, we're looking at the 7-8 games. We're looking at Hawks, Heat. Hawks have been the most perfectly 500 team, I think, in the history of the NBA. Like, if you look at them in segments, they're 500. If you look at them in terms of net rating, they're around 500. Like, everything is a 500 team. So technically, they are like they do have flashes of brilliance, and then they also have these things where it's like, I don't think they got it. And they're going up against Miami, who they played against and had their heads bashed in last year. So that's interesting, because the winner of that will go on to play the Celtics. And if it is Heat Celtics, then that's not your typical 2-7.
No.
Right? And then in the West, it's the same thing, really. It's Timberwolves, Lakers. I think the world wants to see the Lakers be that 7 seed, particularly given the history between the Grizzlies and the Lakers.
Right.
But at the same time, like, you can't just rubber stamp people. And Minnesota Lakers have had moments of lapses of kind of judgment or whatever you want to call it. They're vulnerable. They are a vulnerable team. But the 7-8 games for me are for sure. The 9-10s, we'll see.
Well, here's I think is a bigger question especially when I look at the East 7 through 10. All of those teams to me look like they could be staring down the barrel of significant personnel moves in the offseason. Miami is not used to being in anybody's play-in. Like Eric Spoelstra said, hey, I love the idea of the play-in. It's one of the best things the league has done. Like we all kind of wanted Miami to be in that 3-6 to see if they could pull off the upset against Philly. But do you look at any of those 4 teams and say, you know what, maybe it would be better if they didn't fool themselves into the playoffs and they had to look at themselves with a sober eye and say, Chicago, this isn't working, especially with Lonzo Ball possibly being out next year. Toronto's got a bunch of guys that are you going to be here for the future or are you not? Similar to Atlanta, are you going to hold on to Trae Young? Like, you know what I mean? Like those sort of things. Would it be better for some of those teams to take a look at themselves regardless of how this play-in situation plays out? Because we don't really think, other than Miami, we don't think any of these teams really has a strong chance of pulling off an upset.
Well, look, Lakers, Grizzlies, and you're telling me Steven Adams doesn't play, and Brandon Clark is gone, and Dylan Brooks is in his feelings.
Yeah.
Against this team for whatever reason. And Ja is still trying to return to a sense of normalcy. Like, if you're telling me the Lakers are healthy, you're giving me a healthy LeBron, healthy AD, and a healthy, supporting cast within reason, right?
Do you believe Austin Reeves is unstoppable?
Unstoppable? He's good. He's a good player. He's a good role player. But the great thing is, if LeBron and AD are healthy, that's all he has to be. If those two guys are healthy, Malik Beasley doesn't have to turn into like Klay Thompson or he just has to be Malik. If you're Malik Beasley, if you're D'Angelo Russell, not even all-star D'Angelo Russell, just regular D'Angelo Russell.
Right.
If you're Rui Hachimura, if you're Austin Reeves, that team is good enough to beat the Grizzlies, a weakened Grizzlies. Maybe not the Grizzlies early in this year where they had all their swagger.
Right.
But they've taken some blows here, man. 2 huge injuries, and their star player had to deal with whatever he had to deal with, and then one of their top role players is just unchecked. He's a dude who's running around unchecked. Like, yeah, would think the Lakers would have a very solid chance of upsetting the Grizzlies, probably more so than the Heat beating the Celtics.
Yeah, I can agree with you on that one. I can firmly agree with you on that one. I would give the Heat. I think the Celtics are a bad matchup for Miami unless it turns into a complete rock fight.
I think it's the opposite. I think the Heat are a bad matchup for the Celtics. Celtics like the Celtics probably looking at them like, come on, win some games, get up to 6, man. Why you want to play us?
Yeah, well, put it like this: you're going to come away with scars. Like the Celtics will probably win the series, but they're going to come away a little more battered and bruised than they want to be before going into playing, presumably Philadelphia in round 2, because Philly ain't losing to Brooklyn.
Yeah. And I think the other thing about Miami is, this is a team that missed the most amount of games due to injury of any team in the NBA. Yep. So there is an element of them. They're a 7 seed, but they're not a 7 seed. Like this isn't your typical 7 seed. Whereas I think the Lakers were a bad team that had to go out there and get better in order to get to where they are.
Yeah, I can see that.
Like one team rose to 7 and the other team fell to 7.
Right.
And I think, there's some differences there, because at the end of the day, I think Miami knows, hey, when we have all our guys, we know what to do.
Right.
And the Lakers, as well as they play, there's still an element of like, all right, like we're all doing this. Are we all on the same page? Austin Reeves has never played in a playoff game, right? D'Angelo Russell has never played in a playoff series past the first round, I don't believe. Malik Beasley has been kind of a bit player. Like this is the biggest role he's ever played on a good team. So like you're kind of relying on some guys there. Rui Hachimura, like no playoff experience to speak of. You're relying on some guys outside of LeBron and AD to be and step up to the plate and be something that they haven't been in the past. Even though I just got done saying they just got to be themselves.
Right.
But there's also a playoff version of yourself.
Yeah, there's a whole different level of it. The air is a lot thicker in the playoffs. Right. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Amin Elhassan. That's Darth Amin on Twitter. Remember to listen to him on the Dan Le Batard Show and Basketball Illuminati and Cinephobe and also SiriusXM NBA Radio, where sometimes me and him will do shows on the weekend as the black fill-in host. Amin, thanks for the time, brother. Appreciate you, man.
Thanks, Vinny.
Hey, for everybody listening, thanks again. Don't forget, if you're listening to us on YouTube or Spotify or even your Apple Podcast, rate us, review us, give us 5-star reviews. Let us know what you think of the show. Thanks to John Gennaro behind the glass and him being the voice, the disembodied voice behind the glass today, talking about his Dallas Mavericks. Don't forget, on Thursday, No Cap Room with Jake and Dan. Those guys are doing a great show. Well, don't forget, this is the Ball Don't Lie Network. Plenty of podcasts. We are here every single Monday on Yahoo Sports. See you next week. I'll be somewhere, not in my studio, somewhere watching the playoff game.